When the elevator doors opened on the 27th floor, the air was thick with the smell of Arabica coffee, and something else underneath it, stronger. The scent of expectations simmering beneath silence. It was the first Monday of June. Voltage Technologies was holding a special meeting to announce the new vice president of engineering. Rumors had been spreading all week. It's gotta be Madison. Some people texted me congratulations in advance. Others asked where I planned to take the team to celebrate. I just smiled. Let's wait and see. Truth is, I believed it too. For 8 years, I'd written the original blueprint for VoltCell X, the battery platform that helped VoltEdge win the national EV fleet contract. I'd saved the project from collapse 3 times, filed 2 patents under my name, and earned a state-level engineering award. A promotion wasn't a question, it was overdue. When I stepped into the conference room, the mood was equal parts formal and tense. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls, washing over everyone's faces like stage lights. A few colleagues waved. Logan winked. "Get ready for your speech, boss." I laughed, my heart beating faster than usual. Adrian Holt, VoltEdge's new CEO, stood at the head of the table, arms crossed like a director waiting for the final take. Next to him was a young man in a pale suit, Connor Vale, the chairman's nephew. He was fiddling with a laser pointer, looking like a student who'd accidentally sat in the teacher's chair. "First," Adrian began, voice calm and deep, "I want to thank the engineering team. Thanks to your hard work, VoltEdge achieved 42% growth this quarter." Applause filled the room. I clapped too. My throat was dry, but pride kept it steady. "And now," he continued, "the moment we've all been waiting for, the person who will lead VoltEdge into its next chapter." The room held its breath. Someone whispered my name. A hand rested on my shoulder. I smiled, ready to stand. Adrian looked up, light glinting off his glasses. "Congratulations, Connor Vale." The applause stuttered, awkward and short. I froze. Someone dropped a pen. Another coughed to hide the silence. I waited for someone to say it was a mistake. No one did. Connor stood up, grinning so wide it made the mic squeal. "Thank you, Mr. Holt. This is such an honor." A sigh slipped from somewhere behind me. Adrian patted his shoulder, then turned toward me. "Madison," he said, his tone dripping with syrup, "I want to give you a special thank you. You built the foundation of our technology. You brought VoltEdge this far." He paused, then smiled. "But we need a fresher vision for the future." Fresher. The polite way to say, "You're outdated." I looked at him, then at Connor, the same guy who once asked me if lithium batteries were made from seawater. Silence hummed through the vents. I stood up. "Thank you, Adrian." He blinked. "I'm sorry?" I smiled as if I'd just been promoted. I said thank you for reminding me that in this place, effort doesn't expire, but faith does. A few quiet gasps rippled across the room. Someone hid a laugh behind their screen. Connor fumbled with the laser pointer, its red dot jittered across the ceiling like an alarm. Adrian forced a smile, his lips twitching. "Don't misunderstand, Madison. This is part of our long-term strategy." "Oh, I understand," I said evenly. "Your strategy is to replace people who actually work with people who share your last name." Logan nearly choked on his coffee. The room froze solid. I gathered my notebook, clipped my pen. "Thanks again," I said softly. "Because if today hadn't happened, I might never have realized what my work was truly worth." Adrian tried to recover. "You should be proud, Madison. You built the engine. Connor will drive it." I didn't turn around. "Let's just hope he knows where the brakes are." A chair creaked. Someone cleared their throat to cut the tension. Too late. I stepped out of the room. The elevator doors opened like oxygen after a long suffocation. In the mirrored wall, I caught my reflection. Calm face, faint smile. Outside, the Texas sun burned bright. I stood by the glass tower for a moment, looking up. I used to think this was where I'd spend my life. Now, it felt like the final page of an old book. My phone buzzed. "Logan, you okay?" I texted back. I'm fine. Just wish I'd brought a red pen. I'd circle the word fresher in his speech. I slipped the phone into my pocket. Sunlight shimmered on the pond ahead. Something inside me closed, and something else opened. The anger was gone, replaced by a sharp, quiet clarity. I watched my reflection in Volt Edge's glass facade. The sunlight on my shoulder felt like a spotlight bidding farewell to a role well played. One word lingered in my mind: thank you. Not for them, for me, for having the clarity to smile instead of breaking. I turned away, leaving behind the echo of footsteps from a world I once thought was fair. A chapter closed. And you know what? Every new beginning sometimes starts with just two words: thank you. If you've ever had a day like mine, a morning when your hard work was dismissed, tell me, where are you listening from? I'd love to hear your story, and if you enjoy stories of quiet revenge, where justice is written with intelligence and silence, don't forget to subscribe. Trust me, this story's only just begun. I don't remember how I drove home that afternoon. All I know is by the time the seventh red light turned green, my foot was still resting on the brake. Austin was blistering hot, the sunlight bouncing off the windshield like boiling water. Inside the car, the smell of cold morning coffee mixed with old leather. An oddly unpleasant blend. I turned off the engine and sat still. No crying, no anger, just silence. The kind of silence that lets you hear the clock tick, counting the seconds of a chapter that has just closed. That night, when I opened my laptop, a new company email popped up. Notice: Organizational Adjustment Appreciation Letter. I clicked it open. Volt Edge would like to express our deepest gratitude to Madison Clark for 8 years of outstanding contributions. Due to a shift in our development strategy, we must restructure the engineering division. The termination of employment will take effect on July 1st. We wish you success in your next journey. Signed, Adrian Holt. I read it twice. No meeting, no phone call, just a neatly packaged email sent at 7:48 p.m. That magic hour when HR knows no one dares to reply. A thank you note wrapped in corporate polish, hollow at its core. I laughed. A dry, metallic sound that echoed through my empty apartment, like a soda can rolling across concrete. So that's it. 8 years reduced to 4 sentences and a digital signature. I wasn't angry, just clear. Clear about how loyalty had become an expense they could cut. A message from Logan lit up my phone. They really fired you? Unreal. Priya sent a sad emoji. Dylan, as usual, kept it short. Corporate manners. Thank you before the knife. I stared at the screen and smiled. Exactly. They always say thank you before they stab. I stood up and made a cup of mint tea. The scent of hot leaves filled the air, slowly replacing the smell of plastic and metal. Outside, the rain began to fall. Each drop hit the window ledge like a cold metronome. I opened my laptop again. Volt Edge's internal system was still active. Adrian's first mistake: trusting protocol more than people. Messages flashed across the internal chat. Connor asked who had access to the old project data. A young engineer replied, "No one." Madison holds the original encryption key. I looked at that line and smiled. Not out of pride, just appreciation for life's timing. On my screen, I opened the folder. Archive. Private backup. A single file appeared. Eclipse Dynamics LLC. License DIA X. My fingers hovered over the touchpad, heartbeat steady. I founded that company 2 years ago, the night Volt Edge announced a 30% cut to R&D. I was afraid they'd kill the Volt Cell project, so I filed the algorithm's core module under a separate legal entity, Eclipse Dynamics. I told myself it was just to protect my work, but deep down I knew I was preparing for a day like this. I opened the file. The clause appeared, clean and sharp. In the event of leadership change or termination of project oversight, all rights revert to the original architect until reintegration. I leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. It's strange. When they strip your title away, they sometimes hand you power they never understood. Adrian thought he'd erased me, but on paper, his termination of oversight had just triggered the reversion clause. I took a sip of tea. The bitterness spread slowly, like justice, unpleasant, but satisfying. My phone buzzed again, unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A voice from HR, careful and gentle. Madison, I just wanted to confirm you received the letter. We're truly sorry. This is just restructuring. It's not your fault. I know, I said. Thank you for calling. Would you like to schedule an exit meeting? I think everything's already been handed over. You just haven't realized it yet. Silence. I could hear her breathing, searching for the next line on her empathy script. I hung up before she found it. The room went quiet again. Only rain. I stared at the blue glow of the screen and reopened Eclipse Dynamics. The signature was still there. Madison Clark, original architect. I touched the screen lightly. No anger, no resentment, just clarity. For the first time in years, the power was mine, not theirs. My father used to say, "Don't be afraid when someone slams a door in your face, as long as you remember where you kept the spare key." I smiled, looking out at the rain dissolving into mist. Tomorrow, Adrian would find out the system couldn't run without me. But tonight, I wanted peace. I turned off the lights, took one last sip of tea. In the darkness, the laptop screen glowed, the clause standing out like a quiet promise. All rights revert to the original architect. I whispered, then let's begin. People like to think great revenge begins with a perfect plan. The truth is, sometimes it starts with a sleepless night. 2 years ago, in the summer of 2023, VoltEdge announced a research department restructuring, which was just a polished way of saying budget cuts and shutdowns for any project that didn't make money fast enough. That evening, the lab looked like a graveyard of ideas. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the ceiling fan wheezed like a dying patient on life support. I sat alone in the cold room, watching the monitor flash thousands of lines of code slowly come to a halt, like the heartbeat of a system fading away. That's when I realized, if I didn't save it, no one would. I opened my laptop and started registering a small business. An hour later, the name Eclipse Dynamics appeared on the screen. A tiny company with a few $100s in capital, registered to a rented mailbox on South Lamar Boulevard. Founder? Me. It wasn't a reckless decision, it was instinct. The kind that grows in people who've worked long enough in places where ideas are treated like property waiting to be seized. I still remember one afternoon in a management meeting, a senior executive said, "Good engineers are replaceable, but ideas belong to the company." I nodded at the time, but in my mind, I marked that sentence like the location of a buried mine. A few weeks later, when the R&D budget was cut, I quietly moved the core algorithm of VoltCell onto Eclipse Dynamics' private server. It wasn't theft, it was preservation. Buried deep in the design documentation was a single overlooked line. This product remains under the inventor's ownership until formally purchased. VoltEdge had never purchased it. They just assumed I'd never be bold enough to keep it. I remember the moment I signed the registration form. Original architect, Madison Clark. My hand trembled, fear mixed with excitement, like crossing an invisible line only I knew existed. From then on, after my hours at VoltEdge, I worked for myself. Eclipse had no office, no staff, no signboard. Just me, a laptop, a handful of legal contracts, and a hidden, encrypted folder. Some nights I worked until dawn. I remember the rain tapping the windows, the quiet hum of the machine. I typed each line of code carefully, as if I were stitching together a fragile fabric that others might try to tear apart. The final line I wrote into the system was simple. If the operator is not the original creator, the system will automatically lock. I saved it. And at that moment, I knew I had built a fortress within VoltEdge's own walls. Months later, when I mentioned it to a lawyer friend, he just laughed and shook his head. "You've done something no one in that corporation ever thought of. You built a fence inside their house." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I just wanted to sleep peacefully, knowing that whatever happened, what I created would never become a bargaining chip in their meetings. One night, Adrian Holt, back then still chief operating officer, stopped by the lab. He looked at the Volt cell simulation and asked, "Madison, Do you ever worry that you hold too much power? I smiled without looking up. I'm just keeping what's mine. He said nothing more. A week later, I was reassigned to a side project. That was the moment he started to suspect. But Adrian never understood the simplest truth. Power doesn't come from titles. It comes from knowing when to stay silent and when to prepare. Now, reading the ownership clause of Eclipse again, every word feels sharp and cold as a blade. It states that if project leadership changes, or if the project is terminated, all rights automatically revert to the original architect. And Adrian, with the stroke of his signature, fired me, just triggered that clause. Poetic, really. He thought he'd removed an outdated employee, not realizing he'd just unlocked my ownership of everything. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of cold tea. The mint was bitter, but soothing. Outside, the Austin sky was pale gray, the wind brushing softly against the curtain. I opened my contacts and stared at the name Christopher Dalton, a former colleague, now at VoltEdge's rival, Ardent Dynamics. He was the only person besides me who truly understood how powerful VoltCell was. I didn't reach out yet. I just looked at his name and thought, sometimes justice doesn't need to be pushed. It finds its own way. My phone lit up again. A message from Logan. Connor said they're demoing VoltCell for investors this Friday. Should we warn them? I replied, no, let them flip the switch. I set the phone down and turned on some jazz. A slow, warm piano filled the room. I sat still, watching the light of the screen reflect off my cup. They thought I'd lost, but I was just waiting for them to activate the system exactly as it was designed. No sabotage, no threats, just letting their own rules run to their logical end. I started preparing, reviewing documents, renewing the patent, and confirming IP protections. Every step, every line matched perfectly, like pieces of a machine I had assembled years ago. Before going to bed, I sent a message to the legal advisor who helped me form Eclipse Dynamics. Just a few words. The reversion clause is active. Begin phase 2. Then I turned off the lights. In the dark, the glow of my laptop screen lingered, Eclipse Dynamics shining faintly on the black background. No stage lights, no audience, just the quiet certainty that the game had begun, and this time, the rules were mine. Friday morning, I woke earlier than usual. Austin was heavy with gray, the kind of humid summer haze that makes you feel something is about to break. On the kitchen counter, my phone lit up. A message from Logan. Adrian's demoing VoltCell X today in front of the investors. They even invited the press. Connor's bragging that he's about to prove the future of energy. Guess that future doesn't include you. I set the phone down and smiled faintly. The future. Such a big word, coming from people who've never stayed up all night soldering a power line. I made coffee. The grinder's roar filled the kitchen, sharp and loud, like the lab machines I used to start every morning. On the table, my laptop came to life. The headline flashing on the news feed read, VoltEdge unveils breakthrough battery tech. CEO Adrian Holt promises live demonstration. The photo beneath it showed Adrian in a black suit and silver tie, arms outstretched beneath the VoltEdge logo, smiling like the world revolved around him. Looking at that picture, I thought one thing: the higher someone believes they are the center of the universe, the louder their collapse sounds. At 5 to 9, I opened the live stream. They'd forgotten to revoke access from my old credentials. The first in a series of mistakes waiting to unfold. The feed loaded. A massive hall inside VoltEdge, high ceiling, cold lighting, that cast reflections on the polished floor. The front rows were filled with investors, reporters, and executives. Behind the stage, a giant LED screen blazed with the words, VoltCell X. The future is stored here. Adrian walked out to applause. I heard his voice through the mic. Smooth, confident, practiced like a TV commercial. Today, VoltEdge will prove we don't just talk about the future. We create it. The crowd erupted in cheers. Then he gestured toward Connor Vale, the same kid who once asked me if lithium batteries came from seawater, now walking proudly under the spotlight. And now, Adrian said, let our new VP of Engineering, Connor Vale, activate VoltCell X. The room fell silent. Connor took a deep breath and pressed the launch command. On the screen, the first readings appeared. Output, current, charge rate. A few early claps, investors nodding. Adrian was smiling like a man convinced he had conquered the world. Then, mid-applause, the screen flickered. The indicator light on the console shifted from green to yellow. A dry, metallic click echoed through the hall, like a lock closing. The display flashed 3 times, then froze with a line of text, "Access not verified." Silence. A reporter laughed softly, thinking it was part of the show. Adrian raised a hand. "No problem. Just a signal glitch." Connor hurriedly tried again. This time the screen flared bright, then went black, replaced by bolder text, "Unauthorized activation." Whispers rippled through the audience. One investor leaned to another. "What does that mean? Is it locked?" Adrian forced a smile. "Just a minor hiccup. We have a backup system." But when Connor switched to the backup, the console shrieked with warning beeps. Short, sharp, panicked. The indicator lights turned red. The display changed once more. Unlicensed version detected. Activation blocked. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. An older investor stood up, voice cutting through the tension. "Who owns the software license for this system?" The question dropped like a stone in water. No one answered. Even through the live stream, I could hear the silence. Adrian tried to smile again, but sweat darkened his collar. Behind him, Connor whispered something. Adrian clenched his jaw. "She can't do this. She left the company." "But the system recognizes her as the only authorized user," Connor stammered. I leaned back, lowering the volume, watching the live chat explode beneath the video. Did Voltage lose ownership of the tech? Wasn't VoltCell designed by Madison Clark? Did they even check licensing before the demo? Comments flooded the screen. Thousands watching. Dozens of reporters filming. VoltEdge's stock began to drop before the presentation even ended. I saw Adrian wipe his face with a trembling hand. His voice wavered as he turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is just a test run. A minor technical issue. VoltEdge remains in full control of the platform." And right then, as if on cue, every light in the hall went dark. A thick, absolute silence. Voices rose. Confusion. Chairs scraping. The screech of feedback from the mic. Seconds later, the backup lights flickered on. On the main screen, a single message appeared. Steady, unblinking, sharp as metal. Ownership has been reverted to the original architect. No logo, no signature, just that line, cold and final, ending the presentation in absolute shock. A reporter stood and shouted, "Mr. Holt, can you confirm who the original architect is?" Adrian didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, pale, like a man staring at his own reflection underwater. And in that moment, under the dim lights, I saw it, an empire collapsing, not from an enemy, but from its own arrogance. I closed the live stream. Thunder rolled in the distance. In my apartment, the blue glow of the laptop shimmered on my cup of cold tea. I didn't cheer. I didn't shout victory. I simply smiled, tired but calm, like someone watching justice unfold without a courtroom. Messages from Logan poured in. They're panicking. Stock down 12% in 10 minutes. Adrian just left the stage. No one knows where he went. I typed back. Let them breathe. There's more to come. I set the phone aside and looked out the window. The sky was heavy, split now and then by lightning. From this moment on, everything had shifted. VoltEdge had once been the place where I gave my best years. Now, it was the perfect example of a lesson tech companies rarely learn. When you underestimate the person who built your foundation, that foundation will crumble beneath you. I took the last sip of tea and whispered to myself, "Thank you for the performance, Adrian. You just proved I was never wrong." Outside, the rain began to fall. Steady, rhythmic, and beautiful. That afternoon, Austin was covered in a dull gray haze. The rain fell steadily, mixed with the wind, as if the entire city were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I sat by the window, reading the headlines flooding every news feed. Volt Edge fails during live tech demo. Investors demand clarification on Volt Cell X ownership. CEO Adrian Holt refuses to comment. The stock was in free fall. The same people who once looked at me with polite pity were now scrambling, searching for someone to blame for the mess they'd applauded into existence. I was pouring another cup of tea when my phone rang. Unknown number, but I already knew who it was. Karen, head of HR, spoke in her carefully measured tone. Hi, Madison. I'm calling because Voltage is having some technical issues. The board wanted to know if you'd be open to helping, just temporarily. I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass in a slow rhythm, like the second hand of an old clock. I guess they finally noticed, I said. The clause they ignored for 8 years. Karen hesitated before replying softly. I've seen it. You still own the rights to Volt Cell, don't you? Not own, I corrected. Reclaimed. Her voice lowered. If you're willing to cooperate, Voltage is prepared to offer a very generous sum. I smiled. I'm sure it's generous, but there isn't enough money to buy back trust. Karen didn't respond. The call ended under the sound of rain growing heavier. Not 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't have to check the screen. Adrian Holt. I let it ring 5 times before picking up. His voice was rough, a mix of exhaustion and anger. Madison, I want to handle this professionally. I leaned back. You mean the same way you handled my termination? He ignored the jab, his words quick, desperate. Your system has shut down our entire operation. If you help us restore it, I'll pay you double your previous salary. We can negotiate. The way he said negotiate sounded like a man trying to grab the end of a rope that had already snapped. I spoke calmly, almost gently. You triggered the reversion clause when you signed that termination. VoltCell doesn't belong to Volt Edge anymore, and I have no obligation to restore something that's mine. On the other end, I heard a chair scrape violently, then silence. A heavy breath, followed by a low growl. You're playing with fire. No, I said evenly. I just remember who lit the match. Another pause. Then Adrian spoke again, his voice quieter, almost pleading. You may hate me, but Volt Edge was your home once. Home? I let out a soft laugh. What they did wasn't eviction. They sold the house and asked me to pay rent. I hung up. That night, Austin was wrapped in fog. From my balcony, I could still see the Volt Edge tower glowing through the rain. Its reflection rippled across the glass facade like fire burning inside a storm. My phone buzzed again. An email from Karen. Subject line: Urgent partnership proposal. They wanted to buy back the Volt Cell rights from Eclipse Dynamics for over $100 million. I read every word, then closed it. No reply. I wrote a single line in my notebook. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm just restoring my true worth. Then I turned off the lights, letting the room fall into the faint shimmer of the city outside. Thunder rolled softly in the distance. I leaned against the window frame and whispered, mostly to myself, and Lesson 1 for Volt Edge starts now. 3 days after the system crash, Austin woke under a strange kind of air, humid, heavy, and silent. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes before a storm when everyone knows something's about to break. That morning, every major outlet ran the same headlines. Volt Edge announces plan to renegotiate with original Volt Cell architect. CEO Adrian Holt. We are ready to collaborate for the greater good. His photo covered the front page. Pressed suit, strained smile, the face of a man trying to convince shareholders his empire hadn't fallen. They called the press conference a reconciliation effort. It sounded less like an apology to a person, more like one to a machine. At 10 a.m., I received an official invitation. A private meeting with Volt Edge's board of directors at the Grand Line Hotel, 32nd floor, a room with glass walls overlooking downtown Austin. I arrived on time. No one shook my hand. Adrian stood at the head of the table, his expression hardening when I walked in. I set my bag down, poured myself a glass of water, and waited in silence. The board chairman spoke first, his tone careful, deliberate. Ms. Clark, the company acknowledges your significance to the Volt Cell project. We'd like to discuss the possibility of renewed collaboration as a strategic partner. I looked around the table, 8 faces, 8 versions of the same emotion: tension, hesitation, faint hope, and a pride that refused to die. Adrian stared out the window, saying nothing. I'm listening, I said evenly. The CFO leaned forward. We're prepared to offer $150 million for the full acquisition of VoltCell's rights. In addition, you'd return as Vice President of Technology. The air seemed to freeze. A large number, a powerful title, a safe umbrella. I slowly rotated my glass, watching ripples shimmer against the surface. And if I refuse? I asked. No one answered right away, only the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint tap of a pen against the table. Finally, Adrian spoke. Madison, we don't have to turn this into a war. I understand you're angry, but be realistic. Eclipse can't compete at Volt Edge's scale. I met his eyes. You're right, but Volt Edge can't compete with its investors' loss of faith. The tension shifted. The legal director cleared his throat. You should take some time to consider. We'd like to maintain a positive relationship. I nodded. I like that idea, though positive should probably start with respect. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. This is my proposal, not Volt Edge buying VoltCell, but Volt Edge becoming Eclipse Dynamics' first client. A wave of whispers spread across the table. Adrian frowned. Client? Exactly, I said softly. The system will be relicensed under commercial terms for a limited duration. No more shared ownership. If Volt Edge wants to use it, they pay like everyone else. I slid the folder forward. The cover page read clearly: Exclusive time-limited licensing agreement, Eclipse Dynamics. All eyes locked on it. The chairman flipped through a few pages and stopped at a clause. The purchaser agrees not to access or modify the original source code. All updates, maintenance, and audits are the responsibility of Eclipse Dynamics. Adrian exhaled sharply, voice low. You're turning Volt Edge into a customer of the very technology you created. Don't you find that ironic? I looked at him, calm. No, I find it fair. Another board member spoke, cautiously conciliatory. Ms. Clark, this is unconventional, but if it stabilizes the company, I'm willing to review it. I stood. Thank you. Please review it carefully. The final clause includes a deadline. Deadline? Yes. 72 hours. After that, Eclipse signs an exclusive deal with Ardent Dynamics. Silence filled the room. Thick, absolute. Even the air felt still. Adrian's hands tightened around his chair, his face darkening. I tilted my head slightly, my tone light as air. Last time you signed too fast without reading the fine print. Don't make the same mistake again. I gathered the remaining documents and walked out. Behind me, they stayed motionless. People who once moved millions now frozen, counting every second. When the elevator doors closed, I took a slow breath. It wasn't triumph I felt, just closure. The quiet weight of someone who had finally ended a chapter with her own signature. Below, the city of Austin glimmered under sunlight. I pulled out my phone and opened the mirrored contract already sent to Ardent. Status: pending, awaiting signature. I smiled. If Volt Edge hesitated, they wouldn't just lose the technology, they'd lose the future they once believed was theirs. And me? I didn't need revenge. I only needed the truth to finish the job. That night, Austin glowed like a massive circuit board. Tower lights, car lights, bar lights, all blending together, reflecting off the Colorado River like data streaming through a giant processor. I sat in a small cafe on the 20th floor of the Riverview building, facing the Volt Edge headquarters across the water. Their logo was still lit, as if to prove the Empire hadn't lost power yet. On my table, my laptop was open. The Volt Edge contract read, Viewed, no response. Below it, the parallel contract with Ardent Dynamics displayed a colder line. In negotiation, draft updated. I took a sip of coffee. Bitter. Just enough to stay sharp. Exactly how I liked it. My phone buzzed. A message from Chris Dalton, Ardent's representative, and an old friend who'd left Voltage years ago. Eclipse is doing great. The Ardent board's ready to sign, just waiting on your final confirmation. Be honest. Do you actually want Voltage to still have a chance? I looked across the river. The lights on the Voltage tower shimmered faintly. There's always a chance, I typed back. It just expires. The next morning, Tech Finance ran a full-length piece. Voltage's 72-hour countdown. Can they reclaim Voltcell? The reporter painted it like a race against time. Shareholders panicking, investors threatening to pull out, competitors circling. They called me the hidden architect, holding the key to the future of clean energy. I didn't care for the title, but I didn't deny it either. If they wanted to frame it as a power struggle, I saw no reason to explain that all I ever wanted was fairness. By day 2, Voltage began to move. A corporate attorney emailed me. Polite, measured. We'd like to renegotiate the licensing terms. The board hopes both parties can continue developing Voltcell together. I read it, but didn't reply. An hour later, another email arrived. This time, the number had increased. 200 million. Still, I said nothing. By afternoon, rumors started spreading. Voltage was preparing to sue Eclipse Dynamics for unlawful possession of intellectual property. I just smiled. They still didn't understand. The only thing I'd ever kept was the dignity they threw away. That night, I met Chris Dalton at Ardent's office. No ceremony, no paperwork, spread across the table. Just two people who'd both been discarded by the same system, sitting across from each other again. Chris asked, "You're sure you want to go through with this? Once you sign with Ardent, Voltage won't recover." I met his gaze. "They fell on their own. I just stopped holding them up." He smiled faintly, then leaned forward. "Ardent's offering Eclipse full operational control of Voltcell. You'd serve as chief advisor. I only need one answer. Are you signing?" I looked down at the contract. Every line cut clean, sharp as engraving. This wasn't a transaction. It was a declaration that knowledge can protect itself. I picked up the pen. Before signing, I asked quietly, there was a time I believed if you did good work, people would respect you." Chris's voice was low. "And you learned respect is the rarest form of energy." I signed. One stroke, precise, final. By morning, the headlines erupted. Ardent Dynamics signs strategic partnership with Eclipse Dynamics. Voltcell rebranded as Eclipse Core. Voltage loses exclusive rights. The article called it one of the largest ownership shifts in the history of the U.S. energy sector. I didn't watch the news. I just opened my inbox. Among hundreds of congratulations sat a short, unsigned email with no subject line from Adrian Holt. Only one sentence. "You won, but are you happy?" I read it several times. Then I typed my reply. "No, I didn't win. I just lived by something you never understood." Send. That afternoon, I went back to the same cafe. From the window, I could see the Voltage building. The logo now dim, only a few floors still lit. Reporters clustered outside, waiting for a statement. I sat quietly, listening to the clink of cups, the wind slipping through the window frame. No victory marches, no fireworks, just the calm of someone who'd placed the final brick on the wall of her own justice. I whispered to myself, every system has its failsafe. People do too. You just have to remember how to trigger it. I stood, packed my things, and turned to leave. On my phone, a notification appeared. Voltage files for corporate restructuring. I smiled faintly. No applause, just the sound of wind sweeping over the river. A reminder that every ending, no matter how loud, always fades into quiet. The news of Voltage filing for restructuring spread like a lightning strike. By the next morning, every financial outlet was screaming the same headlines. VoltEdge loses operating rights to VoltCell. Company declares emergency restructuring. CEO Adrian Holt faces emergency board meeting. Investors ask, what really happened inside the tech empire? Television networks looped the same footage. The front gates of VoltEdge headquarters swarmed with reporters. I watched it in silence, the glow from the screen reflecting on the cup of cold coffee beside me. Not joy, just a strange stillness, like watching a building you once lived in being torn down, brick by brick, each one still carrying your fingerprints. At noon, Logan called. His voice trembled between disbelief and sadness. Madison, they let go of almost the entire engineering division. Adrian was forced to resign. He walked out today. No one said goodbye. I listened quietly, the wind faint through the phone. What about you? I asked. I turned in my notice this morning. A few of us from the old team are leaving too. We're thinking of joining Eclipse if you have room. I smiled. Eclipse always has room for people who know their worth. After we hung up, I stepped out onto the balcony. Austin's sky was clear after the rain. The towers reflected sunlight so bright it made my eyes ache. The city felt like it was starting over, though I'd done that years before they ever thought to. By 3 p.m., an internal memo leaked online. Adrian Holt resigns as CEO of VoltEdge Technologies. The board has appointed the CFO as interim head to oversee restructuring. Soon after, a video surfaced. Adrian walking out of the building. No reporters shouting, no employees waving goodbye, just wind sweeping through the empty parking lot, rustling discarded newspapers around his feet. I watched it 3 times, not out of satisfaction, but to remember the feeling. The moment someone who thought himself untouchable bowed to the consequences of his own choices. For a second, I wondered, if that day he hadn't said efficiency matters more than loyalty, would things have been different? Probably not. People who think they own everything always forget loyalty can't be written into payroll. By late afternoon, a journalist I used to know called. Ms. Clark, he said, we're publishing a feature on the fall of VoltEdge. If you'd like, you can share a few words about your journey. I thought for a moment, then said, just print one line for me. Not about me, about that company. What line? He asked. VoltEdge didn't collapse because of technology. It collapsed because it forgot the people behind the technology. He went silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, thank you. I knew he'd print it exactly as I said, and I wanted him to, because sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs a truth that can't be edited. That evening, I returned to the Eclipse office. No longer the tiny apartment it once was, but a full 12th floor suite in a new building. Warm lights, steady hums of keyboards, the rhythm of a company alive. On the wall, the new logo glowed. Eclipse Dynamics, the letter E shaped like an orbit. I stood there for a while. Sometimes the brightest light comes from what was once in the shadows. Lynn, my assistant, approached. Madison, the engineers from VoltEdge just arrived. They said they're ready to start tomorrow. I nodded. Give them space, but remind them. Here, every blueprint bears the name of its creator. No one gets erased. Lynn smiled. Message received. Through the glass, the last light of sunset was fading behind the old skyline. Across the river, the VoltEdge sign still flickered, faint and uneven, like the final bulb in an empty room. That night, I sat alone, writing in the old brown leather notebook I'd kept since my engineering days. On the page, I wrote, I don't need to prove they were wrong. I just need to prove that silence can have weight. I closed the notebook and looked up. The breeze through the window carried the first, cool hint of fall. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its taillights reflecting red across the glass. Everything was finally still. No tension, no anger, just the calm of someone who'd settled the debt between justice and self-respect. I knew the press would keep talking about VoltEdge tomorrow, but for me, that story was over. Because when an empire falls, it isn't the end. It's the opening line for those brave enough to rewrite the rules. And I was simply the first to pick up the pen. The news of Voltage filing for restructuring spread like a lightning strike. By the next morning, every financial outlet was screaming the same headlines. VoltEdge loses operating rights to VoltCell. Company declares emergency restructuring. CEO Adrian Holt faces emergency board meeting. Investors ask, what really happened inside the tech empire? Television networks looped the same footage. The front gates of VoltEdge headquarters swarmed with reporters. I watched it in silence, the glow from the screen reflecting on the cup of cold coffee beside me. Not joy, just a strange stillness, like watching a building you once lived in being torn down, brick by brick, each one still carrying your fingerprints. At noon, Logan called. His voice trembled between disbelief and sadness. Madison, they let go of almost the entire engineering division. Adrian was forced to resign. He walked out today. No one said goodbye. I listened quietly, the wind faint through the phone. What about you? I asked. I turned in my notice this morning. A few of us from the old team are leaving too. We're thinking of joining Eclipse if you have room, I smiled. Eclipse always has room for people who know their worth. After we hung up, I stepped out onto the balcony. Austin's sky was clear after the rain. The towers reflected sunlight so bright it made my eyes ache. The city felt like it was starting over, though I'd done that years before they ever thought to. By 3 p.m., an internal memo leaked online. Adrian Holt resigns as CEO of VoltEdge Technologies. The board has appointed the CFO as interim head to oversee restructuring. Soon after, a video surfaced. Adrian walking out of the building. No reporters shouting. No employees waving goodbye. Just wind sweeping through the empty parking lot, rustling discarded newspapers around his feet. I watched it 3 times. Not out of satisfaction, but to remember the feeling. The moment someone who thought himself untouchable bowed to the consequences of his own choices. For a second, I wondered, if that day he hadn't said efficiency matters more than loyalty, would things have been different? Probably not. People who think they own everything always forget loyalty can't be written into payroll. By late afternoon, a journalist I used to know called. Ms. Clark, he said, we're publishing a feature on the fall of VoltEdge. If you'd like, you can share a few words about your journey. I thought for a moment, then said, just print one line for me, not about me, about that company. What line? He asked. VoltEdge didn't collapse because of technology. It collapsed because it forgot the people behind the technology. He went silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, thank you. I knew he'd print it exactly as I said, and I wanted him to. Because sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs a truth. That can't be edited. That evening, I returned to the Eclipse office. No longer the tiny apartment it once was, but a full 12th floor suite in a new building. Warm lights, steady hums of keyboards, the rhythm of a company alive. On the wall, the new logo glowed. Eclipse Dynamics, the letter E shaped like an orbit. I stood there for a while. Sometimes the brightest light comes from what was once in the shadows. Lynn, my assistant, approached. Madison, the engineers from VoltEdge just arrived. They said they're ready to start tomorrow. I nodded. Give them space, but remind them. Here, every blueprint bears the name of its creator. No one gets erased. Lynn smiled. Message received. Through the glass, the last light of sunset was fading behind the old skyline. Across the river, the VoltEdge sign still flickered, faint and uneven, like the final bulb in an empty room. That night, I sat alone, writing in the old brown leather notebook I'd kept since my engineering days. On the page, I wrote, I don't need to prove they were wrong. I just need to prove that silence can have weight. I closed the notebook and looked up. The breeze through the window carried the first cool hint of fall. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its taillights reflecting red across the glass. Everything was finally still. No tension, no anger, just the calm of someone who'd settled the debt between justice and self-respect. I knew the press would keep talking about VoltEdge tomorrow, but for me, that story was over. Because when an empire falls, it isn't the end. It's the opening line for those brave enough to rewrite the rules. And I was simply the first to pick up the pen. 3 weeks after Voltage filed for restructuring, fall arrived in Austin. The air was cool enough that you could see your breath dissolve into the morning mist. Every morning, I still walked along the river, an old habit I hadn't quite replaced. Across the water, the Voltage Tower still stood, silent. Its logo is dimmer than before, the glass no longer catching sunlight the way it used to. Looking at it, I didn't feel satisfaction, just peace. A late peace, but deep enough to make me understand that true justice doesn't need to be granted. It arrives when you stay steady long enough. Eclipse Dynamics was growing faster than I ever imagined. The new lab was full of light, filled with the sounds of keyboards, instruments, and the occasional laughter of young engineers arguing over designs. I no longer sat in a quiet corner. Now I walked among people who had once been the old parts of Voltage, the ones who understood the value of truth, of work, and of having your name on what you built. One morning, Lynn, my assistant, set down a fresh newspaper on my desk. The front page showed me at the signing ceremony for a clean energy partnership with the Department of Transportation. The headline read, Eclipse, from Volt Edge's ashes to America's new tech icon. I looked at the photo, then set it aside. Once, words like that would have made my heart race. Now they didn't. Because I'd learned, the point isn't to be seen, it's to be understood. That afternoon, I received something rare these days, a handwritten letter. It was from Logan, the young engineer who once texted me, "You're smiling right now, aren't you?" His handwriting was still slightly tilted, careful and sincere. I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I learned that loyalty isn't obedience. I'm leading a new design group now. We're naming our module Integrity Core. I hope that's okay. I folded the letter, holding it between my hands for a moment. Maybe that was VoltCell's true legacy, not the technology, but the trust it left behind. That night, I sat alone on the rooftop, looking out over the city glowing below. Every light in those windows told a story, some just beginning, some ending. I had ended once too, and thought it was over, but sometimes endings are just a different shape of beginning. I remembered that morning when Adrian told me I was no longer aligned with the company's vision. I remembered packing my files, standing tall, and saying 2 words, thank you. Not because I was weak, but because I knew every storm leaves silence behind, and in that silence you finally hear yourself. Now I felt no anger. If that morning hadn't happened, there would be no eclipse. If not for their arrogance, I would have never discovered how far my limits reached. And without those 2 words, thank you, I might have reacted like everyone else, loud, furious, swallowed by my own rage. The wind brushed through my hair. I closed my eyes, listening to the sounds of Austin's night, a distant horn, a train crossing the bridge, and somewhere, soft jazz from a cafe below. If someone asked whether I had regrets, I'd say no, because justice isn't about making others fall. It's about making truth visible. I don't need them to admit they were wrong. I just need them to understand that every line in a contract, every clause ignored, carries power. The power of the one who wrote it, the one who believed in their own worth. Once, a reporter asked me, if you could go back to that day, would you still say thank you? I smiled and said, I would. But this time I'd add one more line. Thank you for giving me a reason to begin again. When the clock struck 11, I stood and looked toward the horizon. The Eclipse logo glowed against the night sky, blending with the stars into a soft, steady light. In that moment, I felt something simple yet profound. I had nothing left to prove. Everything that needed to be said, I'd said through action. Everything that needed to be written, I'd etched into code, into clauses, into the quiet decision to build instead of destroy. Because sometimes the strongest form of defiance isn't striking back. It's standing tall, smiling, and building something better. I rested my hand on the railing and whispered, this isn't victory, this is recovery. Then I turned, stepping inside as the lights dimmed behind me. The room grew dark, lit only by the city beyond the glass. And there, in the calm of the night, I knew. The story had finally closed. Not with collapse, but with peace, because every right choice, no matter how quiet, leaves its own echo.